All right, we will get started. For those who are still straggling and are too bashful to come in, we'll let them come in late, and we won't give them too much of the evil eye. The format for today, I'm just going to make a couple opening remarks and then lob a couple questions to our distinguished panelists. I'm so delighted that we have a real wonderful cross-section. George Baker brings his immense experience in France and his studies and experiences there, among others, with Pierre Cochereau. And, of course, Stephen Roberts, distinguished alum of here, and Clark Kelly, my wonderfully esteemed predecessor, who has both his background from Eastman. I remember the first time I knew of Clark's name was through my teacher, Larry Smith, who wanted me to look at his dissertation on the Leipzig, the Grade 18, which is still, in my opinion, a seminal document on those chorales. And you students, you ought to look it up. So you're going to hear three different perspectives, and the theme today is about pedagogy, something that we know was so very important to Miss Andrews. In contemplating what I might say to you before we enter into what I would call a dialogue about this, and you will have opportunities to ask questions of our panelists as well. My job will be sort of to monitor the time and make sure we stay on tack. But I thought, if Miss Andrews were alive and I could have a conversation with her, what would I ask her? In being presented with the opportunity to come here and to start a whole new organ program, I had long known of the name Miss Andrews in both hallowed ways and fearful ways, frankly, because I knew how much she expected of her students, and I hoped in my own way to have an effect as a teacher, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree with me on this point. Sometimes I fear that I learn more from teaching them than they necessarily learned from me. In hearing more of the stories and having had the opportunity to read some more about her life and what she thought about things, I was inspired that this teacher, who could be very clear and perhaps even rigid in her technical teaching, she changed, which I think is one of the attributes of a great teacher who learns themselves and does not, stay to the same concept of thinking and hearing. One of the things now I know that she and I have in common is a belief in efficient practicing. I believe that the students need to learn how to teach themselves, since they only get us for a short period of time. And as my students know, the most important part of your body in playing the organ are these, and the ability to really listen outside of all the hard work that goes into fingering and pedaling and registering and all of that. So, that's my first question. If Miss Andrews were here, what might she say about what has gone on, what is going on, and what might go on in the future? So the theme today is, although things have changed, most certainly, there are some things that have stayed the same. So, distinguished panelists, could you summarize as best you can your perspective on both Miss Andrews' pedagogy as you saw it and your own pedagogy, so past, present, future? So any one of you can take a stab at that. We don't have to go in any particular order. George,
Well,
you want to start off?
I'll start. I'm not a pupil of Mildred, but I knew Mildred. I met her, chatted with her a number of times, and of course, two of her star pupils were friends of mine and colleagues of mine, Clyde Holloway and Charles Benbow. Charles, I got to know in France, and he won the Grand Prix de Chartres, the second one, which was in 1972. So I got to know him in France quite well. In fact, I went to a concert in Paris at Saint-Séverin that Benbow played. It was all Messiaen organ music, and I remember very well, it was about 10 minutes into the concert that here come Olivier and Yvonne Loriot, his wife, scurrying up the middle of the church, to the front. They didn't sit in the back. They had to come up to the front. I guess the organ sounded best because it's in the back, Saint-Severin. And, they were finding a place, and then afterwards, Charles came down, and Miss Jan, we had a party in a little apartment close to the church, and that was the first time I met Miss Jan. And that was lovely. Charles spoke so highly of Mildred and was just enamored, I guess, in love with her in a way, in a nice way, in a kind of maternal figure for him. And I think Clyde was the same way. He just adored her. And yes, she was strict, but by golly, if you're going to do anything great, you have to work at it. You don't pop out of the womb knowing how to do things great. You have to become that by working. I mean, even Bach and Mozart, they worked. I mean, look at the volume of stuff they did. You don't just do that, in your spare time. You devote your life and your brain to doing that. And so I think with her, and for Dupre, her teacher, Dupre was always a stickler about playing things correctly and having good posture and the discipline. And if you were late to class, you didn't get in. The door was locked at 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock when his class started. And I like that, because I think you need to eventually be your own coach and be your own worst critic. And talking about ears, I think that's very important when you're serving as your own coach. Record your playing. Record your playing and step back and be an objective listener, because they're with your brain, doing the playing. You can't have that same perspective as you do when you listen. You sit back and listen to what you did. So I think recording yourself is a really important tool, and I would encourage any student or anybody who's a musician, record yourself, buy a little recorder. They're cheap these days, and record your stuff and critique it like you're somebody else, like you're the teacher of this person that's playing. That's something I discovered. One more thing, and I'll let someone else talk. I discovered also when I was, I think, 16 and working with Bob Anderson at SMU, that if I fingered my music, I played the same key with the same finger every time. I learned it faster, and I could memorize it faster. And then when I came back to the piece later, I could relearn it a lot quicker. And I wondered, why is that? And I think it's just simple neurophysiology. Your brain makes connections, and it like a hard drive, it remembers. Your memory remembers those movements. And if you put the same finger on the same note every time, that just makes that chemical bond stronger. So I'm a big advocate of fingering music, and if somebody can't play the right notes or is screwing up, I said, look, I don't care what you do, but if you want to play better, I think you should finger your music. Now, people like Koshro never fingered anything. And
really?
They could, I never saw one finger in a score of Pierre. No. He didn't need it, I guess, but you see in Dupre's scores, even Dupre's own music, there are places where he will finger things that are mainly difficult. He gives a fingering in places. In those places, sometimes I will disagree. I said, no, this is better. And so I think, take those fingerings with a grain of salt and make it better. Make your own. That works for you and your fingers and your, his fingers may have been longer. Koshro's fingers were like this long. He could play 12ths. like that. His thumb was like that, you know. You know what they say about thumbs.
Oh, God.
But anyway, and he wasn't that tall a guy, but the stretch was just monumental.
Rachmaninoff
and it
hands.
really, yeah, Rachmaninoff hands and Franck hands, and so he could do things, you know, play those chords and those voicings, thanks to that big stretch that he had. So I think fingering your music, record yourself, discipline yourself, get up early in the morning if you have to, just drink some coffee, discipline yourself to get up like Rocky did, you know, and drink those raw eggs. But that's the way you get great. That's the way you can really progress and become a greater artist. It's not easy, and sometimes it's not fun, but I think, you know, at least for me, I think it's paid off. So, you know, that's my 2 cents.
The one thing I can say fairly certainly, if Miss Andrews were alive today, she would be very different from the way that she was certainly when Elaine or Dorothy studied with her, because we know that she never stopped learning. And that was the thing. She came to this, as George said, with that same background. I realize now that a lot of that this stuff really came originally from of course naturally from Lemons, but from Guillemot, because Dupré was much more was very closely influenced by Guillemot, and Miss Andrews' teaching, I think, was very much influenced by Guillemot, because she was a student of Palmer Christian, who Palmer Christian was a Guillemot pupil. And I think, on the one hand, some things that would never have changed. She was very much a believer in what George was just talking about making sure that you had your music fingered and used the same fingering, worked it all out very carefully. But at the same time, you know, teaching has changed so dramatically in the past 40 years. We went through this period of extreme historicity, I would say, and we've kind of gone beyond that now. But our perspective has changed because of that. And I know, especially through influence of one of my other teachers, Anton Heiler, and later Harold Fogel, that a lot of the teaching has changed. And I'm sure she would have incorporated all of that into her teaching. But still, the fundamentals were those of the Lemons, Guillemot, Dupré school. And I don't think she would ever have changed that. Really don't think, because she was a big believer in that. And the one thing I want to say about Guillemot, and I just discovered this, and George, you could correct me, because George has really got an encyclopedic knowledge of all this stuff. You know, I used to poo-poo those Franck editions of Dupré. But now, you know, Dupré says in the preface that he got that information directly from Guillemot, who got it from Franck. What I didn't know is how short Guillemot was. Guillemot was a very small man, and he could only reach a ninth. And so now, what I am convinced that he must have discussed this with Franck about what to do in the places where you had somebody who couldn't possibly reach all the things that are there in the original editions. Do you agree with that? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Even though there may have been a connection with Guillemot to Franck, I have a story that Longley told me. Longley studied with 3 Franck pupils.
Yeah.
Adolphe Mauti, Albert Mao, and Charles Tournemire.
Right.
Three, and they gave, you know, stories. They told them how Franck's class was and whatnot. But one place, for example, in the Dupré edition of Franck, in the pièce Héroïque, in the middle, in the Dupré edition, he has the trompette in the right hand and the flute in the left. No, Franck, it was the inverse.
Yeah.
It was the flute in the right hand and the trompette. The trompette on the Récit at Saint-Clotilde was very petite and very delicate.
Yeah.
And so it balanced, you know, not so much in a lot of other organs, but it did there. And Langlais brought that up with Dupré and said, but 3 Franck pupils taught me, and they all said the flute in the right hand, you know, and Dupré didn't like being wrong. And so he says, well, if that's the way they played it, then you just play it that way. You know, and he turned and he stormed off. And you know, Langlais was a little bit, perhaps not so diplomatic at times, but you know, he told the story when the Germans came in World War II, they wanted to play the organ at Saint-Clotilde, and Langlais said, no, you're not going up here. And Langlais was a little guy like 5'4", and you know, but he was intimidating as anything, and you know, they talked amongst themselves, and they just pulled out a cigarette and turned around and walked away. So Langlais stood up to the Nazis, and so he, you know, I could see him spitting back, you know, some inaccuracy to Dupré. Although he loved Dupré and he got a lot from Dupré, had studied with him even after his first prize at the conservatory. Mm-hmm. Studied several more years, coached with Dupré privately. And, you know, of course Dupré was a fantastic musician and a great teacher and a great friend, I think, if you were loyal to him. If you weren't, then, you know, woe unto you. Just ask Jean de Messier, you know.
Yeah. Well, Vidor and Dupré both had sort of ruled the Parisian musical scene.
Oh, yes.
That if you crossed them, you did so at your peril.
Yeah.
And but you know, getting back to Miss Andrews, I really feel that we were very fortunate to have gotten that sort of undiluted tradition. And I highly recommend, if you don't have it, to get Roland Smith's Vierne book, mm-hmm. because it has a complete translation of Mes Souvenirs, the memoirs of Vierne. And Vierne talks a lot about the classes that he had with Franck, and then how the classes were different with Vidor and then with Guillemot. And a lot of the descriptions of technical things that Vierne describes there were exactly what we were taught. Exactly.
Interesting.
And
Dr. Kelly.
yeah.
Yes, I didn't have the good fortune, as Steve did, of being able to study with Miss Andrews, but she was very much a part of my musical life all the way along. I grew up in Arkansas, and our first big educational opportunities as organ students there were to go to, for instance, Dallas to hear master classes where George's teacher, Robert Anderson, would bring in a number of the great European virtuosi and bring them to SMU and have master classes and seminars of various sorts. And I remember from the very first one that I ever attended that Miss Andrews was always there with a group of her students, that she was extremely interested in exposing them to these marvelous people that came over. I remember Andre Marshall, I remember Anton Heiler was eventually my teacher, Marie Claire Land, a number of those types of people were there, and there was always a large group of University of Oklahoma students. So I got to know a little bit about Mildred from those students and respected very much the enormous level of discipline that I saw in them. And then, as I said, a few years later, I was lucky enough to be able to study on a Fulbright with Anton Heiler. And while I was in Europe, I attended some of his master classes, which he did in Haarlem and in Holland with Marie Claire Land and other specialists. And I had the pleasure of being there for at least one when Mildred was there with a group of her students sitting there in the loft at St. Bavo, and it was very much the same thing. Enormous attention to every detail that was being discussed, where she was extremely alert to every word that was said, and wanted to be sure that her students were taking note of everything. I remember her watching over this group of I thought, very lucky people that she had with her. And I remember that those classes often would rotate between French, German, Spanish, whatever the teacher was holding forth in at any given moment. And I even remember Miss Andrews interrupting after Marie Claire Land had acquitted herself of a long comment that went on in French for quite some time. And I remember Mildred lifting her finger and saying, "Now I want you to repeat every word of that in English." Extremely aware and alert of all of the performance trends that they were discussing. And as Steve and George both said, you know, what we've seen in her was a great love for learning about those traditions. And while she did early on in her career establish certain guidelines that as an approach to things, she was always willing to go beyond that. So when I came here to the University of Oklahoma, that was in 1980, I was the only one of 5 finalists for the job at the time who was not a former student of hers. She was on the committee, and I can still remember playing my audition while she sat there with a clipboard taking notes. That was fairly intimidating, believe me. And while I had not been her student, I took it as a great privilege that my first years here, before she got quite ill, my first years that I had the opportunity very often to have discussions with her about just music in general, but what my students were doing. I had very often, if my students were going to a competition to play, I asked her to come to the church and listen to them play their pieces. And I always learned so much from her, just her wonderful observations about every parameter of the music. And so while I knew that up here she had a list of 5 things that should have been done no matter what, nevertheless she could still stop and listen objectively to what my student had done and make observations based on where we had started and where we were going. So I had this great legacy to follow here, but I also felt like that I had a privilege there when I first came, that I was able to get to know her and understand some of those things. I certainly agree with the things that I'm hearing here. That I think she would be fascinated to read every one of Rollin Smith's every time he comes out with a new book or a new edition. I think she would be absolutely fascinated and soak up all those details that she could get. I do remember her talking to me about, is it okay if I go on for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
She was quite fortunate she was an extraordinary student herself, but she was fortunate by the time she was a junior in her undergraduate career here, she knew that her teacher who adored her, Louis Salter was his name, was going to retire. And so everything was all worked out so that when she finished her senior year, she was immediately hired as a teacher here at the university. But in those days, everything was done, a bachelor's degree was just the beginning of your apprenticeship, and there was no such thing as a doctorate in Oregon. And a master's was nice, but you still had to work as an apprentice, but you had to go out and find great people to learn more about your craft. And so she was determined from her undergraduate days that she absolutely was going to get to Marcel Dupré and study with him just as quickly as she possibly could. So she had it all set up that she was going to go and take lessons from him. He was teaching at the University of Chicago when she graduated. And so that very first summer, she hadn't expected to be brought onto the faculty quite so quickly, but they gave her a summer school load to teach. And so she arranged it where she literally left in the night, took the train to Chicago, went to Chicago to take her lesson with Dupré somewhere at the end of the next day, and then hopped back on the train and was back to teach all the rest of her lessons for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, all of that stuff that would have happened Monday, Tuesday, and she's back to teach. But she, from day one that she was on the faculty here, she was working beyond the boundaries of Oklahoma to become the finest artist that she could be, and then to learn as much as she could for the benefit of her students. So she had this wonderful experience with Dupré even before she went to do her master's with Palmer Christian at Michigan later. And I think that's part of what I saw in her still to the very last, was that she was extremely interested to know what opportunities her students had availed themselves of to develop these areas of specialty. If there was a composer for whom they felt a great affinity, had they gotten to the person who was the acknowledged authority about that. So that's why the Fulbright opportunities pleased her very much. She was in place at the time right after World War II when the war reparations, those grants started out, as many of you know, as Fulbright Hays grants were the European nations agreeing to repay us by allowing our students to come over there and make those educational opportunities available. So Mildred, of course, immediately became aware of where the centers were where her students could have the best opportunities. And she still could tell you which ones were the ones where you wouldn't want to go to study. She always was fully aware of all that. But if she knew that a student wanted to go to France, she knew exactly which teachers to recommend. She knew other places, and I know that when some of the countries would sort of get overloaded with students, and she knew that they wouldn't stand a very good chance if they even applied to go to England. And no, you're not going to England. You're going to apply and go to Copenhagen, or you're going to go to Brussels, or you're going somewhere else, but you're not. I'm going to see to it that you can do this, but here's how we're going to work this. Here's what we're going to do to finesse it. And so her students had great opportunities. Obviously, she loved everything French, and the French opportunities were always available. But she also saw to it that several of them studied in the other European musical centers, and Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Vienna, and so we were talking back through all of that. It was fascinating to see that it was no accident that she had more Fulbright winners than any other organ teacher in the United States. She was, from the day that they became available, she knew exactly how to advise her students to apply for those grants and get them ready to do it, and see to it that all those opportunities could be a part of their future. So those are some observations.
I have one more line of questioning, and then I want to open the floor up to all of you who may have questions for our distinguished panelists. You've given us a wonderful overview, I think, of sort of Mildred's background and how it applied to her time and place, and we've heard from both George and Stephen how, those are things that are essentially unchanged. The one area that I wanted to ask about is, of course, in the area of technique, and I wonder, should she not strike me down for this, how many of you still play pedals like this? Anybody? Okay, Stephen does. You used to. This is one area that I would absolutely flatly disagree with Ms. Andrews, and we would probably agree to disagree on it. I think where pedagogy is now, and probably in the future, dare I suggest it, is that I think now, with a more integrated approach to education, we are now, I think more so than even Ms. Andrews was in her time, aware of the physicality of the body, of body alignment. There's been more research and science in this area, and the effect of contorting the body in certain ways that I call it the pay it forward effect. I wonder, so two-part question, what do you think of the idea, and I will confess, my first organ lessons were that too. Knees together, heels together. My teacher never strapped my legs together. But is that anecdote false, by the way? No. Oh.
It's not false.
It's not false? She did that? Yeah, to make sure that they stay together. Wait. I soon departed from that. For my own teaching, I'm keenly interested in efficient practice, ways that the form follows function. Technique should allow a student to play easily and accurately, and if there's an inaccuracy, there's almost always a physical explanation for it, or something that we're not digesting. So, what do you think of the idea of both the heels together, knees together, and then a Dupre-ism, as you saw, yesterday's the wasms become the isms, or the isms because the wasms. The idea of half values, the sort of the rhythmic, almost mathematical derivation of repeated notes and articulation. Does it still apply today? Should it? And if not, what would Ms. Andrews think? Sort of loaded question. George, you want to take a stab at it? He's looking at me.
The latter part of your question, I don't think so. I disagree with that completely.
With the metric,
the half, repeated notes, half on, half off. Why? Because when you do that in lots of places, for example, in Bach, what happens if you have a note tied over that's repeated, like a 16th, a quarter tied to a 16th, new measure, repeat, the second 16th. If you lift that up on the downbeat, the harmony is changed.
Yes. Bingo.
That might even be a dissonance.
Yes.
And the harmony is changed, and you have a triad and not a seventh chord, which totally screws up the harmony. So
I pitched it and you hit it home.
not
Thank
violently,
you.
not violently disagree with, but just, I guess, vehemently, with alacrity, disagree with that.
Yep.
Because I think Bach wants his harmonies to sound. And if they don't sound because of some, artificially created system of repeated notes, you're messing with Bach, and I don't think you should do that. So I think, and also, it depends on the tempo, the acoustics, the registrations as to how much air there is between repeated notes. You have to, again, use your ears, your brain, and always, as Marie Claire said, you have to have good taste. Whatever you do, it should be, there should be le bon goût. Yeah, good taste. Otherwise, it's certainly not French, and it's not musical, And so I think that's a place where we agree. And about this, I don't know. That just hurts me to look at you do that.
Yes.
I don't. This is very unnatural to do this right here. I mean, You know, this is, I think you should, whatever is comfortable for you, you should do that. Whatever gets the job done. There's a drawing of Jean Lin that you probably have seen. It's a drawing where the organist is on the bench and his feet are up here playing the manuals and his hands are like 8 feet long playing the pedals. I mean, that's clever and funny and everything, but maybe he was actually making a point, like, I don't care what you play it with, you could play it with your head, you know, if your head was pointy enough, but just get the job done. Get the job done, so when you're listening to the music, you're not watching the player, the music is beautiful. Oh, well, he played a fifth finger here instead of, he shouldn't play the thumb. I don't care, just do what you want to do and mean to do, and use whatever physical and mental means to achieve those goals.
Yeah. Stephen.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Well, please, that's what this is all about.
First of all, does anybody know what the source of these of the questions about links are?
I was going to ask the same thing.
Yeah. Does anybody know? I can tell you exactly where this comes from. It comes from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach.
Correct.
And you know, they were so quick, people are so quick now to dismiss the French Bach tradition. But something that nobody has really investigated yet is what Hesse's teaching was. And that is the missing link, because we know that in the early 19th century,
Adolf Hesse, right?
Yeah, Adolf Hesse, who was the teacher of Lemons, and he's the one who establishes the link to the Bach school. I do think that discuss this. I think that that's a good way to start, to at least give somebody a spatial understanding of where things are down there. But you're going to have people who just simply can't do that. And if what happens is that by keeping your legs together like this, that tension occurs, well, then that is not a good thing, especially tension all around the back. But it's a good, I think for most students it is a good way to start. And there is no question that this was exactly the way that the Lemons School taught. That came directly from Lemons, and Vierne describes this in great detail about Widor's class, and talking about Widor's technique. That came, Widor, all the Lemons pupils agreed about that. Whether we do it now, I mean, we play so many other things besides that. Yeah. And so I just don't think that it has any application to any other literature. Now, I do think that this is something Ms. Andrews talked about, and I want to make sure that everybody else remembers this too. One thing Ms. Andrews did talk about is that no one-motion staccatos. That means that every single note has to have a duration. Now, it's not necessarily that one-half duration exactly. And that was only a beginning, because, I mean, if you listen to Dupre's recordings, he doesn't do that either. It's a starting point. And what he means is that one must get a sense of every single note and how long every single note is. And because the durations of note is one of your main expressive features on the organ.
So
is
the only
touch.
things we have, yeah.
Exactly, touch. So that I think is really valuable. It is also interesting. I know this is something I discussed with Daniel Roth. Daniel Roth didn't believe this, but I sent him a list of things, and I showed him exactly the page where every single thing that is described in the Lemons book is discussed in CPE Bach's book. The only thing that is not discussed is the thumb glissando. But of course, naturally, that wouldn't have been important to discuss in a clavichord treatise. But everything else, even tying common tones in certain situations. And I think the techniques were the same, but their musical application became different. That's what I think where a lot of this stuff came from. So,
Dr. Kelly.
All of it.
Ditto is what you said.
I remember listening to Mildred do the half value lifts in an extremely demanding way when she was at pedagogy demonstrations that she did when she was teaching students to get started using the Dupre 79 chorales. That was her favorite book to do that with. And as you say, she wasn't teaching Locklear. She was teaching Dupre, and she was teaching something that was extremely methodically written for pedagogical reasons anyway. So I found that, and I think that would be her philosophy in listening to this, that some of these things that we remember her being such a stickler about were things to help us get a start, a well-grounded start, creates the right kind of a spatial a field for the geography of it all. But I really, remembering her critiques of things that I talked to her about in the repertoire, and getting ready for these competitions that I was talking about, where some of my students were playing very extraordinary music that wouldn't fit any of those rules. I don't remember her being hard-nosed. I think she had mellowed in every way about that once she got into the advanced repertoire, and
And before you do it, make sure you talk about this too.
Oh, about that.
Yes.
I remember at one of those classes I was telling you about in Haarlem, in Holland, and where there was my teacher Anton Heiler had just played the pedal cadenza in the toccata, Bach toccata, adagio, and fugue, and there was a moment of absolute, everybody held their breath at the beauty of it all, and all this, quite quiet over there where I was sitting, and she leaned over to one of her students and said, "Now, didn't that just sound angelic?" And the girl said, well, yes. And Mildred said, "Well, imagine how much better it would have sounded if he kept his knees together." And I heard this.
Oh my God.
Yep.
But really all of that, I think you have to remember where we were at that point.
Context
we
is
were
important.
students, and the thing is, this was all about establishing facility, technique, and control. And that's what really was that was the final goal. And Miss Andrews always said, you said something earlier that was one of her big battle cries. She said, well, my goal is to teach you to not to need me anymore, not to be dependent upon somebody, but to be able to teach yourself. Right. And that's really what this was all about, and that's why she taught hard pieces, because she figured you could learn the little ones on your own, but she could help you crack the nuts for the tough things, and so that's what I think was really all about.
One of the things before we have questions from you all, my first year here, and I can't even remember who I got it from. It was a little cassette tape that had a little article that she had written, and it was her voice. She was reading it. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about. It was sort of a summary of her beliefs, and one thing, there were several things that I thought really good about. One thing stuck out in my memory, because at that time I didn't know very much, at least in terms of I didn't have access to primary source material as to what Mildred really thought and believed. It had a lot of anecdotal information, and the reputation of the strictness, the rigidity, and all that stuff. Well, in it she described, I have used the Dupre method because it's something I have found that has worked for my style. But
Yeah.
she was very definite, but said, it's not the only way. And I thought, aha. Because to me, a real pedagogue always admits, this is one way, but there are others. There's no, and because I think students, we tend to idolize our teachers in a way, and we should absorb everything they have to teach us, but it isn't a religion.
No.
And it's not infallible, and it is a continuing tradition. So, but I thought it was very important that she said that.
Yeah.
This is a way that worked for me. It's a window. I think, I really believe that these students are living in probably one of the most balanced, polyglot ages for the organ that has ever existed before. When I was a student, the very concept of having a theater organ was blasphemy.
Yeah.
It probably still is, but we did it anyway. But the whole idea of understanding performance practice, if I preach anything around here, is that performance practice is a window through which you look. It's not a religion. It can inform how you hear the music. Lee and I were talking about Leonhardt and this beautiful idea of all the different kind of sounds you can have from varied articulation. It's all about listening. But to view what Miss Andrews did through the window and context of her time and place, there is something to be said for consistent approach, which produces a consistent result.
Yeah.
Is it the only way? No. So, questions? Trying to keep an eye on the clock. I figured since we started late that we'd go to 2:45, if that's all right. Yes.
Regarding the adherence to the Dupre method, she had changed from what you're saying. She had changed over the years, but certainly in the early part of, when she had just returned from studying with Dupre, she was slavishly imposing that upon her students.
To every one of them?
Every one of them. I hadn't followed the Dupre fingering even though my hands are small, and I couldn't do it. Nor could I do the pedaling because I'm short. So I would fall off the bench.
Yeah.
And yet she said, no, you have to do it the way it's written, the way he put it in there, in the box. So it was not to assist you physiologically, it was more to adhere to a specific principle. But she apparently then changed and mellowed as time went on and realized, no, not everybody can play that way.
Was she that rigid with you?
No. And the thing is, she was, you got to understand, Dorothy, that Miss Andrews was a young woman whenever you studied with her. And, she was still learning it. She was a work in progress, as we all are. And what I think the Dupre, I know this is probably going to be heresy, but I still have a lot of my beginning students use Dupre if they can't, if they don't have very good fingering practices when they come, because there is something about the discipline of working at your fingering very, very carefully. And what you're doing is you're using, it's a classical model kind of teaching, which is a very traditional way, because you learn by doing something. And what Ms. Andrews told me once was that the whole idea to do this, if you had normal, average size hands and were average height, what this did was it taught you, gave you good habits and consistent habits, so that whenever you started to do your own fingering, then you weren't you would automatically reject things that were awkward. And that was, I think, was another key. Somebody hit on this earlier about, I think it was Lee, was her insistence upon economy of motion. But once again, that came directly from France, from the French, and also from C.P.E. Bach, because C.P.E. Bach describes that too.
Nancy Lancaster, I was discussing this issue with Nancy, and she said that she felt that one of the reasons Miss Andrews used the Dupre editions was because, remember, she was teaching 25 or 30 students, and she didn't have time to go over fingerings with them. But there was a framework that was already there.
One size fits all.
She doesn't have to go in and deal with all of the fingerings for each of the students. It's there.
Use it.
And, you know, she would work, I don't know about everybody else because there are other students here, but whenever you were having a problem, she would always help you to work it out. And, you know, if something was not working, she would tell you, this is not, let's look at what's going on here. And sometimes her reasoning process of going through the finger, she was just brilliant at that sort of stuff. I remember she had so many tricks, things like practicing the Vidor toccata with the, you know, in octaves, in the right hand mirroring the left, and really what it is that's the same thing as that Hannon does, because the weak fingers are paired with the strong fingers in the other hand. Mm-hmm. So she was a genius at that kind of stuff. But I think she got that because she had you know, this background of Dupre. But you know, she had changed a lot by the time I think we were students. She was mellowed a lot, I think. That's true.
Mm-hmm. Lee.
Great, still sort of talking about Dupre and talking about the rhythmic of the half values and things. The other thing is that I remember fairly late in her life, and she and I were talking about some things, and I sort of asked about the development of her way of teaching, and she was talking about, especially in the early years, through the 50s, 40s, 50s, even in the early 60s, that she really needed to instill in her students how to make the organ a rhythmic instrument. And yeah. She said because most of these kids are going to go out and play on probably not terribly good instruments for the most part. Yeah. And trying to make the organ have rhythmic expression. And that was one of the reasons she was very careful about instilling this half value from the Dupre method. But then again, as the student, you know, progressed and such, then she didn't mention, she would not talk about that quite as much. Well, it's partly just to make the organ a rhythmic instrument.
I think she and Hans von Bülow would have gotten along. Hans von Bülow said about music, in the beginning was rhythm.
Yes.
And that is really was, I think, a great hallmark of her playing. She thought that rhythm was so very important, and that also comes from Guillemot, because Guillemot's teaching was very much like that. They talk about his very strict playing of strict rhythmic playing of allegro tempos.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Americans tend to go over to Europe and fetishize these perceived truths, to bring these back in a fetishized version. So they ruin what was actually learned, because it's become a fetish.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly true.
Dr. Kelly, would you agree with that?
I was just something going back through my mind about her enormous interest in listening to Steve talk about ways to help students that went far beyond someone else's fingerings that they'd written on the page, and her ability to get you out of all kinds of difficult spots. But and some of you, I know, have already heard me tell this story before, but that I was also present at a master class, and in fact this happened at SMU, where Marie Claire Land was giving her pitch on her brother's famous piece, Litanies, and
here it comes.
Some of you know what the punchline is, but the point was that she was had gotten to the conclusion of the piece with the wild terrorist diminuendo with the left hand that goes on line after line until and at some considerable torment to the performer, and so Mary Claire was talking about this and about the fact that this was just one of those places in music where the illusion was the most important thing. The impression was that it truly was an impressionistic spot in the music, and that do the best you can with this, folks, but don't let it bother you too much, because we've learned in the family that we just pretty much we do the best we can, get as many of those notes as we can, and just charge through that passage. and Mildred's hand is up, and in fact, I'm not even sure she raised her hand, but she immediately said, "Well, my students know how to play it." and she basically had developed an absolutely virtually foolproof routine and had it so that this terribly difficult spot, the University of Oklahoma students had
Played all the notes.
and she showed it to Mary Claire, and Matt Lynn was just absolutely delighted with the whole thing, and was totally charmed by the entire experience. So
Dr. Kelly, I was delighted when we went over to the American Organ Institute, because her copy of the litanies is there, and you can see the little trick that she did, which above each one of those chords she wrote major and minor.
Exactly. That was what I was going to tell you. What major, minor, and diminished. It was the quality. It was not so much a fingering question. It was understanding how
What's the
chord, what the chord felt like under the hand, according to its quality. And that was the.
And just occasional finger.
Yeah.
And as an interesting side note, it was just yesterday. Arlene's not here, I don't think. No. She told me at lunch yesterday, and when did she study? Was it later?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
She told me about the litanies that Miss Andrews at that point said, well, those are merely for effect. Here's how you play it, but don't worry about it too much.
Yeah.
I told that to Dottie yesterday. She goes, what?
She would have.
Yeah. Yes.
75, 76 is when she heard it.
Okay,
But
so, yeah.
believe me, there was
Before that.
time.
Yes.
Stephen, could I ask you something on a different topic? We're talking about rhythm and precision, all that. When it came to her teaching a Dupre score, did she mention anything about interpreting the music and putting your own stamp on the interpretation, or just, as we hear Dupre said, just play the notes as they are in the score? That's the way I want it.
Well,
and yet he didn't do that on his own recordings, you know?
Yes. But she realized, I think, that was, she had an ideal, and you had to adhere to that. But I think she was wise enough to know that if you had two different individuals playing the same piece, that it would be different, no matter what. You cannot copy somebody else's playing. I'm sorry, it's just not possible. And she was wise enough to know that. So I think what she was going at was really, it goes back to the control factor, because she wanted you to get the control so that would free you to express what you were what you were feeling there. And I never felt like she was any way constricting to me in interpretation. She was actually quite free with that.
I'm watching all of these heads
except for rhythm. That was the one thing that she would not tolerate. If she could not understand what the rhythm was, she would tell you that right away. And if you're listening as a listener, rhythm is the one thing that really helps you to understand what the piece is. And so that was, I think, was the key. So she didn't, she didn't talk about that, but it happened.
Go ahead.
Finished the Royka this morning. Elaine Ehlers leaned over to me and said, he has Mildred's rhythmic drive.
Well, that was the thing that she was really, rhythm was her big thing, I think, and that, she shares that in common with Gilmore, so.
I have one final question, and it's actually for all of you. And my caveat to what I'm about to say is that it's not an indictment at all. It's just my impression going through my own career, both as a student and then later a teacher. I will assert that I think one of the gaping holes in previous generations in organ pedagogy was the idea of talking about sound, registration, sound, the components of pipe organ sounds, how to register the stops, the conceptions beyond recipes. Do you think it's important? Because many of my teachers really, we didn't discuss it. And I've not heard yet, and I would like to be corrected, if Miss Andrews discussed registration much. Yeah.
Despite the miserable Kimball, she was very precise about registrations. I still have them written in my scores.
Yeah,
There wasn't any guesswork.
was clarity. That was
It
what.
was clarity.
That
Okay.
was what she really wanted. But it was, I think everybody remembers her saying this. She would sort of joke and say, well now, if we were at a Schnitker, we would do this. But since we're not, we have to do 2, 4, and 6 here in the pedal and couple the swell at 4-foot pitch. Yeah, so
I like her saying of the organ serviceman here that he didn't know how to tune mixtures, but it didn't make any difference because we don't have
we
any.
didn't have.
But I'm thinking that's part of the evolution of the Fisk, and truly part of the amazing story of it is that she was extremely impressed that it was the decade of the 1970s when American universities first started having some really they were good, at least they were good, mechanical action organs that were being built. Not all of them were beautiful, but they were impressive. And she attended several of the summer master classes at Fort Collins, Colorado, where she heard the Phelps organ that was on their stage. And she said, this is something you're going to have to make happen here at OU. Somehow you're going to have to get a mechanical action instrument in here that's in a premier spot, and I don't know how you're ever going to do it, but just remember that we're going to have that here. So I know that issue, yes, she knew that they had to make the best sounds they could on a Kimball here for a while, but she also was concerned that the whole issue of registration of beautiful sounds on an organ was going to be there.
Well, there's one thing more that I wanted to add about that. He put his finger on something. Do you remember, students, how Miss Andrews always picked your hand up to make sure that you let all of the weight drop on the key and was transferred to the bottom of the key? Well, I know now why that was. Because it had nothing to do with what we were playing here. If you play historic instruments, that's the only way you can protect yourself from doing physical injury, is by making sure that all of this is relaxed and that's transferred to the fingertip. Because what happens, if you look at somebody like Daniel Roach, who plays it as Saint-Sulpice all the time, all of his arm weight goes onto the key. So this was actually something that had come from a much longer period of time, much before that. And she was continuing a tradition which really had stretched back for centuries. I know that they've come to that now. Peter Van Dyke talks about that when you go to Akmar, and also Michal Radulescu talks about it a lot. But that's what they've come to, is that all of this has to be kept relaxed, and it's transferred to the fingertip. Yes?
And her piano study, I can't help but think that that would have,
Oh, yeah, sure. It's all arm way, because that's the way you make tone.
And she had us all have the Brahms 51 exercises, and she had a routine, and 30 minutes every morning she practiced the Brahms 51 exercises on the piano. That was the warm-up.
Yeah.
I had a teacher in Nice, 2 summers, Jean-Marie Darret from Paris Conservatoire. And if anybody needed any advice on how to live your life, she was the prime example. Every morning, 8 to 4 o'clock.
Yep, that's right.
Chopin etudes.
Yep.
And she had all those sets. Remember, so all she had to do is sit down and play it. But she didn't skim. She said, I did this every day. And she was already 58 years old.
Yeah.
So she practiced what she preached.
Yep.
And the journey goes on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please express appreciation. I hope you all found this as extremely stimulating as I did. This is fun.